It was a typical summer evening in 1969 when the Johnson family, consisting of parents Carol and John, and their two children, Emma and Liam, vanished from their home in the small town of Chesterfield. The sun had begun to dip beneath the horizon, casting a soft orange glow over the town. The evening air was warm and still, with the sounds of crickets chirping in the distance. It was the kind of peaceful night that seemed like nothing could go wrong. In the small town, everyone knew everyone, and the Johnsons were no exception. They were a well-liked family, known for their kindness, warmth, and down-to-earth nature. Their house sat at the end of Elm Street, a quiet residential neighborhood where people took pride in their lawns and waved at each other as they walked by. Chesterfield was the sort of place where nothing out of the ordinary ever seemed to happen. Carol and John Johnson were in their mid-30s, having settled into a comfortable routine. Carol, a stay-at-home mother, had just finished cooking a simple meal for her family. John, her husband, worked as a local mechanic. Their two children, Emma and Liam, were young, full of energy, and the picture of childhood innocence. They were often seen playing outside or riding their bikes down the street, their laughter filling the air. Life in Chesterfield had a quiet, predictable rhythm, and the Johnsons seemed to fit perfectly into that. They were friendly, helpful, and always ready to lend a hand when someone needed it. They were, in many ways, the epitome of what a family should be. On the evening of July 12, 1969, the Johnsons were last seen by their neighbors as they sat down to dinner in their cozy, modest home. The evening had unfolded like any other, with the family gathered around the table, enjoying their meal and talking about their day. Carol had prepared a simple dinner of roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and fresh vegetables from their garden. Emma and Liam were likely arguing over who would get the last piece of chicken, or debating which television show they wanted to watch after dinner. John was probably teasing them lightly, the way fathers do. There was nothing that night that seemed out of place, nothing that hinted at the tragedy that was about to unfold. But by the next morning, everything had changed. The Johnson home, once filled with the sounds of family life, was eerily silent. The front door was found unlocked, a detail that seemed strange given how careful the Johnsons had always been about locking up before bed. The television, which had been left on during dinner, was still running, the screen flickering with static. Their personal belongings, keys, wallets, and even Carol's purse, were left behind, as if they had simply walked out without taking anything with them. Emma and Liam's toys were scattered across the living room, and the family's shoes were left by the door. No signs of struggle, no broken windows, and no evidence of forced entry were found. It was as if the Johnsons had simply vanished into thin air. The local police were called immediately, and a search was launched. Officers combed through the house, the surrounding streets, and even the nearby woods. But there was no sign of the family. There were no footprints leading away from the house, no indication that anyone had been taken against their will. It was as though they had just disappeared without a trace. The police initially considered the possibility that the family had left voluntarily. But why would they leave in such a hurried manner, without taking any of their belongings or even locking the door behind them? The more the investigation unfolded, the more questions piled up, and the fewer answers were found. The neighbors were just as perplexed as the authorities. No one had seen anything unusual that evening. No one had heard any strange noises or witnessed any suspicious activity. The Johnsons were known to be a happy, well-adjusted family. They weren't involved in any sort of trouble, and they had no known enemies. They weren't the type to run away, and there were no signs of financial or personal issues that might explain their sudden disappearance. Carol and John had a stable marriage, and the children were well-loved and cared for. The idea that they had left voluntarily didn't seem to add up. And yet, there were no other theories to explain what had happened. As the days turned into weeks, the mystery of the Johnsons' disappearance began to grow more complicated. The police extended their search to surrounding towns, even enlisting the help of search dogs and helicopters. Volunteers from the town joined in, combing through the area for any signs that might lead to the family. But no clues were found. The once bustling home on Elm Street stood empty, its windows boarded up, the garden growing wild with neglect. Over time, the search effort began to lose momentum. The case slowly turned cold, with no leads or evidence to go on. Life in Chesterfield returned to its quiet, uneventful pace, but the disappearance of the Johnsons remained a dark shadow over the town. It was a mystery that no one could explain, and it seemed that the answers would never come. As the years passed, the town's residents began to move on, but the memory of the Johnson family's disappearance remained in the back of their minds. Every year on July 12th, the anniversary of their vanishing, people would remember the family they once knew so well. Some would leave flowers by the Johnsons' old house, a quiet tribute to a family that had once been a part of the community. Others would whisper about the mystery, speculating about what could have happened, but no one ever found an answer. Over the decades, the case faded from public attention. It became one of many unsolved mysteries that Chesterfield had tried to forget. The police files on the case were archived, and the family's name was slowly forgotten, buried beneath the years of unanswered questions. But the story of the Johnson family's disappearance never truly disappeared from the town's collective memory. It lingered, a haunting reminder of how a seemingly ordinary family could vanish without a trace. And yet, despite the passing of time, the question remained, why? Why would a well-functioning, happy family like the Johnsons simply disappear without any explanation? The town of Chesterfield would never forget the mystery, and for those who still remembered, it would remain one of the darkest and most baffling chapters in their history. The disappearance of the Johnson family was a puzzle that no one had been able to solve, and it was a question that haunted the town for decades. What had really happened to them? And would anyone ever uncover the truth? The day after the Johnson family was reported missing, the small town of Chesterfield was thrown into chaos. The local authorities, along with friends, family, and volunteers, sprang into action. The entire town seemed to come together in a frantic effort to locate the missing family, each person hoping for some shred of evidence, some sign that they were still out there somewhere. The search began immediately, with volunteers walking through the town, knocking on doors and asking questions. People wandered the streets, searching for anything unusual, anything that might provide a clue to the family's sudden and inexplicable disappearance. The woods surrounding Chesterfield, dark and dense, became a focal point for the search. There had been no sign that the Johnsons had left the house on foot, but the authorities had to consider all possibilities. The woods were thick with underbrush, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead, and there were many places where someone could hide or become lost. Teams of searchers scoured the area, combing every inch of forest for any evidence that the Johnsons had ventured there. The local police even brought in search dogs to help track the family's scent, but they found nothing. The woods, like the town, seemed to hold no answers. What baffled investigators even more was the fact that the family's car was still parked in the driveway. It sat there untouched, as if they had simply walked out the door and vanished without taking it. The car, a simple station wagon, was a glaring symbol of the mystery. If the family had left willingly, they would have likely taken the car with them. And yet, it remained behind, parked neatly in front of their house. The car's presence suggested that they hadn't left on their own accord. If they had been forced to leave, why wouldn't they have taken it with them? The absence of the car in their getaway was a strange clue, one that seemed to contradict all assumptions. As the search efforts continued, it quickly became apparent that the Johnsons had left no traces behind. Their home had been left in what appeared to be the middle of an ordinary evening. The dinner table was still set, with remnants of the family's meal scattered about. The television was left on, casting a dim glow in the otherwise dark house. Their personal belongings, wallets, and keys were still at the house, untouched and undisturbed. If the family had planned to leave, they had done so without so much as a goodbye. But if they had been forced to leave, where were they? The lack of any struggle or evidence of foul play left authorities stumped, and no lead seemed to provide any new direction. In the following days, investigators worked tirelessly to piece together any scrap of information that might provide a breakthrough. They spoke with neighbors, examined local businesses for any potential sightings of the family, and even checked surveillance footage from nearby areas. But the town of Chesterfield, quiet and peaceful as it was, offered little to no information. The Johnsons were a well-liked family, and no one had ever seen anything unusual about them. No one could recall anything that seemed out of place or suspicious in the days leading up to their disappearance. As the search continued, the authorities struggled to make sense of what had happened. Were the Johnsons simply running away? Had they left of their own accord, for reasons no one knew about? Or was something darker at play? The longer the search went on, the more the hope of finding the family began to dwindle. What started as a frantic, coordinated effort turned into a slow and agonizing investigation that seemed to be going nowhere. Weeks passed, and then months, and still, there was no sign of the family. The authorities expanded their search radius, reaching out to neighboring towns and counties, but the results remained the same. The family had vanished without a the ace, and the mystery surrounding their disappearance only deepened. Each new day seemed to bring more questions and fewer answers. The townspeople, once hopeful, began to wonder whether the Johnsons would ever be found. As time went on, the case began to fade from the headlines. The story of the missing family, once the talk of the town and the focus of local news, slowly slipped into obscurity. Other stories emerged, and life in Chesterfield returned to its usual rhythm. People went back to their routines, and the memory of the Johnson family's disappearance became something of a distant, forgotten tragedy. The police, too, moved on, focusing on other cases that demanded their attention. The investigation, though still officially open, became one of many cold cases. The once vibrant search for the Johnsons had slowly turned into an afterthought, a mystery left unsolved. The town of Chesterfield, once consumed by the loss of one of its most beloved families, slowly returned to normal. But there was always that lingering sense of something missing, an uncomfortable gap where answers should have been. In the back of people's minds, the mystery of the Johnson family's disappearance remained. They couldn't help but wonder what had happened, and why the family had vanished so suddenly. Was it a family tragedy, a personal decision to start anew, or was there something more sinister at play? As the years went by, the case became one of those dark stories that people whispered about in passing, their curiosity never fully satisfied. The longer the case went unsolved, the more rumors and theories began to spread. Some believed that the Johnsons had simply left, possibly fleeing from a dangerous situation they were involved in. Maybe they had run into trouble with a business deal or someone they knew, and they decided to disappear to start fresh. Others speculated that the family had been the victims of foul play, perhaps kidnapped or murdered by someone who knew them. The police dismissed these theories, but the town couldn't help but entertain the idea that there was something more to the Johnsons' disappearance than met the eye. But no matter how many rumors circulated or theories emerged, no one had any concrete answers. The case remained open, but no new evidence came to light. The Johnson family had vanished, and the mystery surrounding their disappearance lingered in the hearts and minds of Chesterfield's residents for years to come. Even as the years passed and the town moved on, the memory of the Johnsons' disappearance never fully disappeared. It was a haunting reminder of how something so ordinary, so seemingly safe and familiar, could vanish without a trace. It was the kind of mystery that gnawed at the town, a question that never truly went away. Where did the Johnson family go? And why? For over 50 years, the disappearance of the Johnson family had remained one of the most perplexing mysteries in the town of Chesterfield. It had become an unsolved case that seemed to slip further into the shadows with each passing year. The faces of Carol, John, Emma, and Liam Johnson faded from public memory, replaced by the hustle and bustle of everyday life. No one really expected the case to ever be solved, and the search efforts had long since ceased. That was, until 2022, when an unexpected breakthrough would reignite the case, uncovering shocking revelations that no one had anticipated. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. It wasn't from a tip-off, nor was it from a new eyewitness testimony. It came through a routine investigation into an entirely different matter. The FBI, while conducting an inquiry into an underground criminal ring that had been operating in the area for years, stumbled upon some long-forgotten documents tied to the Johnsons' mysterious disappearance. As part of their broader investigation into criminal activities, agents had started going through old, cold cases to find any connections that could be relevant. What they found in the process would change the course of the Johnson family's case forever. In the dusty archives of police records, buried deep in the files from the 1969 investigation, the FBI uncovered something that had been overlooked for decades. It wasn't just a small clue or a passing mention in a report. What they found was something far more significant: a letter hidden away in a box of old police files. This letter, which had never been seen before, had been written by one of the neighbors in the days just before the family's disappearance. The FBI immediately realized that this letter could hold the key to unlocking the mystery that had baffled Chesterfield for over 5 decades. The letter was strange, cryptic even, and it didn't provide clear answers. The writer's identity was never fully verified, but the letter's contents hinted at something darker than anyone had suspected. The tone of the letter was odd and filled with vague references that seemed to allude to a hidden truth, one that, until now, had never been considered. The writer mentioned the Johnson family in passing, noting how the family had been acting differently in the days leading up to their disappearance. The letter suggested that the Johnsons had been involved in something much larger and far more sinister than anyone had ever realized. It wasn't just a case of a happy family vanishing for no reason. According to this mysterious letter, the Johnsons had become entangled in something dangerous. The contents of the letter painted a picture of a family unknowingly drawn into the criminal activities that had plagued the town for years. While the town had always thought of the Johnsons as an ordinary family, it turned out that they had been connected to something much more troubling. The letter indicated that John Johnson, the father, had gotten involved with individuals who were part of a local crime syndicate, and that his involvement in illicit dealings had put the entire family in jeopardy. The writer of the letter hinted at a growing tension within the family, with John's secretive actions and unexplained absences raising concern among those close to him. It suggested that John's attempts to hide the truth had been failing, and that those who were involved in his illegal activities might have been closing in on him. This was the first mention of any connection between the Johnson family and the criminal underworld in Chesterfield. It had never been considered during the original investigation in 1969. At the time, investigators had dismissed any notion of the family's involvement in criminal activity, believing them to be the victims of a random and unexplained tragedy. The idea that John Johnson might have been involved in something dangerous was dismissed as speculative at best, and no further investigation into that possibility was pursued. The case had remained unsolved, with no leads or evidence to suggest a more sinister explanation. But now, 53 years later, the FBI was finding that the family's disappearance might not have been as random as it first appeared. The discovery of the letter led the FBI to reconsider the earlier investigation. As they reviewed the case files, they realized that several leads had been ignored or dismissed as irrelevant at the time. Now, in the context of their ongoing investigation into the criminal syndicate, These leads seemed worth revisiting. The more the FBI looked into the Johnson family's background, the clearer it became that there was more to their disappearance than just a simple case of people vanishing without a trace. The letter hinted at a connection between the Johnson family and individuals who were known to be part of a much larger network of criminals. While the letter didn't name names, it suggested that John Johnson had become entangled in something much more dangerous than anyone had realized. It also implied that the family's sudden disappearance could have been the result of John's actions catching up to him. The FBI speculated that John might have been forced to go into hiding, perhaps with his family, to escape the dangerous individuals who had targeted him. The fact that no trace of the family had been found, and that they had seemingly disappeared without a trace, only added to the suspicion that they had been forced into hiding for their own safety. The FBI's newfound investigation into the Johnsons' disappearance was not only a revelation, but also a deeply chilling turn of events. The town of Chesterfield had always assumed that the Johnson family had vanished for reasons unknown, perhaps even voluntarily. But now, with the discovery of the letter and the ongoing investigation into the criminal ring, the picture was slowly starting to change. It seemed more and more likely that the family had been the victims of circumstances beyond their control. The significance of this letter could not be overstated. It not only provided new evidence linking the Johnsons to a dangerous criminal world, but also reopened the case in ways that no one had expected. As the FBI delved deeper into their investigation, they found that the family had likely been swept up in something much larger than anyone in Chesterfield had ever imagined. The town that had once seemed so peaceful and idyllic now appeared to have a hidden, darker side. What had seemed like an isolated, inexplicable tragedy was slowly revealing itself to be part of a much larger web of crime. For over 5 decades, the Johnsons' disappearance had remained a mystery. But with the FBI's intervention and the discovery of the letter, the case was now back on track. The town of Chesterfield would never be the same again. The secrets that had been buried for so long were now coming to light, and the truth about what happened to the Johnson family would finally be revealed. The question remained: could the FBI unravel the full extent of the story before it was too late? Or had the Johnsons' fate been sealed long ago by the very people they had been trying to escape? The answers were closer than ever, but there was still much left to uncover. The letter uncovered by the FBI pointed to an unusual connection between the Johnson family and a local crime syndicate that had been operating in the area, a connection that no one had ever suspected. The Johnson family had always seemed like the epitome of a perfect, happy family. They were well-liked by their neighbors and had been viewed as pillars of the small town of Chesterfield. Their lives were marked by stability, with John Johnson working as a mechanic, Carol staying home to care for their 2 children, Emma and Liam, and everyone living a simple, wholesome life. On the surface, they were just like any other family in the neighborhood, but beneath that perfect exterior, things were far more complicated than anyone had realized. John Johnson, the father, had always been a quiet, reserved man. He kept to himself and didn't share much about his personal life. His friends and co-workers knew him as hardworking and dependable, a man who could be counted on when help was needed. He was the kind of person who would never attract attention, always trying to avoid any form of conflict or controversy. But it turned out that his quiet nature hid something much darker. According to the letter uncovered by the FBI, John had become entangled in the underworld of illegal business dealings. What had initially started as a minor association with a few unsavory characters had escalated over time, pulling him deeper into the world of organized crime. The letter, written by a neighbor who had observed John's behavior in the months leading up to the disappearance, shed light on a side of John that no one had known existed. The neighbor described John as becoming more secretive, often leaving the house for long periods and sometimes returning in the early hours of the morning. While the family appeared to be living their normal lives, it was clear that something was off. The neighbor had mentioned seeing John talking to several men in dark suits, men who didn't seem to belong in their quiet neighborhood. These men, as the FBI would later learn, were linked to a powerful local crime syndicate known for its involvement in money laundering, extortion, and other illegal activities. The letter hinted that John had gotten involved in these activities not out of necessity, but as a way to make extra money. The pressures of supporting a family, along with a desire to secure a more comfortable life, had likely driven him to make poor decisions. The criminal syndicate, seeing an opportunity, had slowly pulled John into their operations. The FBI discovered that John had been handling illegal transactions and laundering money for the syndicate, using his position as a mechanic to provide them with cover for their activities. He had kept everything hidden from his family, never letting on that he was involved in such dangerous dealings. Carol, his wife, had no idea that John was mixing with dangerous individuals or putting their family at risk. John had worked hard to keep his secret life concealed from her and from everyone in the town. But secrets, especially those tied to criminal activity, are rarely kept for long. The letter suggested that someone had caught wind of John's involvement. It wasn't clear who exactly had discovered the truth, but the letter alluded to the fact that John had made enemies in the process. The dangerous world of money laundering and organized crime was full of ruthless people who did not take kindly to betrayal, mistakes, or someone trying to back out. The FBI theorized that John had become a target, either because he had tried to back out of the syndicate's operations or because someone had seen him as a threat. The crime syndicate, in its pursuit of maintaining control over its illicit activities, likely saw John's situation as a liability that needed to be dealt with before it became an issue. The theory put forward by the FBI suggested that the disappearance of the Johnson family was not a random event. The family's sudden vanishing seemed to be tied to John's criminal involvement, possibly as a way for the syndicate to send a message. It could have been a warning, an effort to silence John or punish him for crossing them. The letter suggested that John may have been forced to flee with his family, going into hiding to protect them from the syndicate's retribution. The town had believed that the Johnsons had simply left voluntarily, but this new information painted a very different picture. Still, even with this new theory, the case remained puzzling. If the crime syndicate had been involved, why had the entire family vanished without a trace? Why had they not been found in the years that followed? If they had been forced to leave town, why had they left everything behind? Personal belongings, identification, and even their car? The lack of evidence of forced entry or struggle in the home was another piece of the mystery that didn't seem to add up. If the family had been taken against their will, there should have been signs of a struggle, or at the very least, some kind of trace. But there was nothing. The house was left undisturbed, and the family's disappearance remained as perplexing as ever. The FBI's theory now centered on the possibility that the Johnsons had been made to disappear, but perhaps not in the way they initially thought. Instead of being physically abducted, the family may have been coerced into fleeing, forced into hiding by the threat of violence or worse. The fact that their car was still parked in the driveway indicated that they had left on foot, and the lack of any sign of struggle suggested that they had left under duress, but without the immediate danger of physical force. Perhaps the family had been given the option to disappear, to leave everything behind and go into hiding to escape the syndicate's reach. The idea that John had betrayed the syndicate and that they had threatened his family seemed to fit the available evidence, but there was still much that remained unknown. The idea of a warning gone terribly wrong also lingered. If the family had been forced into hiding, it raised the question of whether they had been followed, tracked, or monitored during their time in hiding. Had someone from the crime syndicate found them, or had they been caught in the crossfire of the syndicate's operations? These were questions that the FBI had to consider as they tried to piece together the full story. The more they dug into John's involvement with the syndicate, the more complex and dangerous the situation seemed. The shocking part of all this was that the Johnson family, with their seemingly ordinary and happy life, had been unknowingly involved in such dangerous dealings. What had started as a desire for financial stability had ultimately spiraled into something far more sinister. The fact that the family had become entangled in a web of criminal activity was a revelation that no one had expected. The Johnsons, a family that had once seemed so familiar and safe, had been caught up in something much larger and far more dangerous than anyone in Chesterfield had ever known. As the FBI continued to investigate, they hoped that the pieces of the puzzle would eventually come together. But the biggest question remained: what had happened to the Johnsons? Had they been forced into hiding, or had something more sinister occurred? And if they had been forced to disappear, would they ever be found? These questions continued to haunt the investigation as the search for answers grew more urgent. What was clear, however, was that the disappearance of the Johnson family was not as simple as it had first seemed. It was the result of a series of decisions, mistakes, and dangerous connections that had put an innocent family at the mercy of those who would stop at nothing to protect their criminal empire. As the FBI continued their investigation into the mysterious disappearance of the Johnson family, they began to revisit locations that had been searched during the original investigation in 1969. These areas had been thoroughly combed by local law enforcement and volunteers when the family initially went missing. But over the years, as the case went cold, many of these locations had been ignored or forgotten. Now, with a fresh set of eyes and new information pointing to darker possibilities, the FBI decided to re-examine these places, hoping to find something that had been overlooked. It was during one of these new searches in a remote part of the woods near Chesterfield that the investigators made an unsettling discovery. The woods, thick with underbrush and difficult to navigate, had been one of the areas that had initially been searched, but no trace of the Johnsons had been found back then. Over time, the dense trees and tangled branches had made it an easy area to overlook. However, when the FBI arrived at the site this time, they noticed something that hadn't been there before: a fresh set of footprints leading into the woods. The footprints were faint, suggesting that they hadn't been there for long, but they were distinct enough to raise alarm. They were too fresh to have been left by anyone other than the missing family. As the agents followed the trail deeper into the woods, they came across an area that seemed out of place. A small clearing where a pile of fallen leaves had been disturbed. Beneath the pile of leaves, the FBI agents made a discovery that would shift the entire course of the investigation. Buried beneath the leaves were several personal items, unmistakably belonging to the Johnson family. Among the items was a family photo album, its pages slightly weathered from years of being buried, but still intact. The album, once a cherished family keepsake, was now a chilling reminder of the family's sudden departure. Alongside the album, they found a set of keys, likely the keys to their home or their car. The keys, now rusted and covered in dirt, were a sign that the family had left in haste. But perhaps the most unsettling discovery was the child's toy, an old stuffed animal, faded and worn, but clearly belonging to one of the Johnson children. It was a heartbreaking sight, as it suggested that in their flight from whatever had been chasing them, the family had been unable to take everything they valued. This discovery, buried beneath the layers of fallen leaves, painted a disturbing picture. These were items that had clearly been left behind, either in the rush to escape or as a result of being pursued. What made this find particularly unsettling was the fact that these items had somehow been overlooked during the original investigation. The fact that they had been buried beneath the leaves and remained undisturbed for decades only raised more questions. How had these items been missed in the past? Was it possible that the investigators had been looking for the wrong clues? Or had they simply failed to see the significance of the scene? The implications of this discovery were profound. If the Johnson family had left their home voluntarily, they would have taken their personal belongings with them, especially the children's toys, which were often treasured items. The presence of the toy, along with the other personal belongings, suggested something much darker. It appeared that the family had been forced to leave their home in a hurry, perhaps by an external force that had left them with no time to pack or gather their things. The items they left behind seemed to indicate that the family hadn't been planning to leave permanently. It wasn't a voluntary escape. It was a desperate flight, a hurried departure spurred by an imminent danger that had made them leave everything behind. The FBI's theory began to take shape. It seemed that the family had been pursued, and their disappearance was the result of something far more sinister than a simple case of voluntary flight. The evidence pointed to the possibility that the Johnsons had been forced into the woods, either by the criminal syndicate that had been connected to John Johnson's dealings, or by someone else entirely. But who could have forced them into the woods? And why had they been pursued in the first place? One of the most pressing questions that arose from the discovery was the nature of the pursuit. Had the family been followed by someone who was watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike? The footprints found at the scene suggested that whoever had forced the family to flee had been close behind them. If the family had been running from danger, it was likely that they had been followed for some time, perhaps even before they left their home. The fact that they had left their car behind was another troubling detail. It suggested that they had made their way on foot, trying to escape without being detected. This idea of a chase, with the family running from an unseen threat, made the whole scenario feel more urgent and terrifying. The FBI began to consider the possibility that the family had been targeted by someone within the criminal syndicate that John Johnson had become involved with. The fact that John had been involved in money laundering and illegal activities had made him a potential liability, and it seemed likely that the syndicate had decided to take action when they saw him as a threat. The presence of the family's personal items in the woods indicated that they had been forced to flee under duress, perhaps because John had crossed the syndicate or had been caught in a situation where he could no longer keep his involvement hidden. The FBI speculated that the family may have been trying to escape the consequences of John's actions, possibly to protect themselves from retribution. Yet, there were still unanswered questions. If the Johnson family had been pursued into the woods, why hadn't anyone heard or seen anything? Chesterfield was a small town, and people were generally very aware of what was going on in the neighborhood. If the family had been chased, why hadn't anyone noticed anything suspicious? The fact that the town had heard nothing about a potential threat or danger made the situation even more perplexing. It was as if the danger had come from within the family's own circle, perhaps from individuals who were involved in the syndicate but had remained hidden in plain sight. The more the FBI dug into the case, the more complex and layered the mystery became. The discovery of the personal items in the woods had given them a significant clue, but it also raised more questions about the true nature of the Johnsons' disappearance. The FBI now believed that the family had been running from something far more dangerous than anyone had initially imagined. But the question remained: who had forced them to leave, and why had they been targeted? Was it simply the result of John's criminal activities, or was there something even darker at play? As the investigation continued, the FBI hoped that these answers would soon come to light. But with each new discovery, the case seemed to become more enigmatic and troubling. The woods had once been a place of peaceful solitude, but now it held the key to solving a mystery that had haunted Chesterfield for over 50 years. The most shocking revelation in the case came from a new investigation into the background of the Johnson family, which revealed a side of their lives that no one had ever suspected. In the weeks leading up to their mysterious disappearance, there had been subtle signs that not everything was as it seemed within their household. Carol Johnson, the mother, had been quietly reaching out to a distant relative, someone who, it was now discovered, had been deeply involved in the same underground crime syndicate that had played a part in John Johnson's own dealings. For years, the Johnsons had been viewed as the picture of suburban perfection. They were a well-liked family in the small town of Chesterfield, with no known enemies and no apparent issues. John, the father, had worked as a mechanic, and Carol stayed at home to care for their two children, Emma and Liam. Their lives appeared to be calm and uneventful, filled with routine and normalcy. But behind the scenes, things had started to unravel. Carol, as it turned out, had been aware of her husband's involvement in illegal activities for some time. While she had tried to shield her children from the truth, she had slowly begun to realize the full extent of John's ties to the criminal underworld. At first, Carol had hoped that it was just a temporary phase, something her husband would eventually grow out of. But as John's involvement with the crime syndicate deepened, Carol became more and more uncomfortable with the dangerous world he was entangled in. As a mother, her primary concern shifted from simply protecting her family's financial well-being to keeping them safe from the very people John had been associating with. In the months leading up to the family's disappearance, Carol had started making plans. She had been reaching out to a distant relative who, she believed, could help her escape the dangerous situation she and her children were in. This relative, whose identity had been carefully hidden for years, was someone who had long been estranged from the family. However, Carol had secretly contacted this relative in a desperate bid for help. The relative, it turned out, had been involved with the same criminal syndicate that John had been associated with, although the relative's role had been even more deeply entrenched in the organization. This person had been missing for decades, believed to have disappeared under mysterious circumstances, but the FBI's investigation would soon reveal that the relative had been living a life of secrecy, working behind the scenes within the criminal world. What shocked the FBI even more was that Carol had been trying to distance herself from John's criminal activities for a long time. She had secretly started gathering information to expose the syndicate and take them down. This wasn't just about leaving her husband. It was about protecting her children and starting a new life far away from the dangerous world John had gotten them involved in. Carol had planned to leave John, taking Emma and Liam with her, and escape the suffocating grip of the criminal syndicate. She had been in the process of making arrangements, gathering resources, and finding a way out. Unfortunately, Carol's plans had been discovered by the syndicate before she could carry them out. Somehow, the criminals got wind of her intentions, and they weren't going to let her or her family leave without facing dire consequences. It became clear that the syndicate had been aware of Carol's attempts to gather information, and her decision to flee had put them on high alert. The realization that Carol was trying to expose them, or worse, leave and betray them, was likely the final straw for those in the syndicate who felt threatened by her actions. The FBI theorized that the family's disappearance was a direct result of Carol's decision to escape the criminal network. The syndicate, seeing Carol as a liability, may have forced the family into hiding or worse, silenced them to prevent any further threats. The true extent of the Johnsons' plight began to emerge slowly, and the situation was far darker than anyone had imagined. The family's seemingly perfect life had been built on lies, and they had become caught in a dangerous web of organized crime that they could no longer escape. Carol's determination to protect her children and expose the truth had led her to make the ultimate decision, one that would result in her disappearing with her family. They hadn't intended to vanish forever. They hadn't run away to start a new life in the traditional sense. They had gone into hiding to protect themselves from a force far more powerful and dangerous than they could have anticipated. Then came the final twist that made the case even more chilling. The FBI, in their continuing investigation, took DNA samples from the personal belongings found during the search. They were hoping to match the DNA to any family members or associates who could provide more answers. It was then that they made a startling discovery. The DNA taken from the family's belongings matched that of a long-lost relative of Carol's. This relative had been missing for decades and was believed to have disappeared under mysterious circumstances. For years, the town of Chesterfield had assumed that this relative had simply vanished, never to be heard from again. But in a shocking turn of events, The relative was found to have been part of the criminal syndicate the entire time. This new revelation opened up even more questions. The connection between Carol's family and the crime syndicate ran deeper than anyone had realized. The missing relative had likely been involved with the syndicate for years, possibly even recruiting Carol's husband into their operations. The fact that this relative had stayed hidden for so long suggested that the family's ties to the syndicate were much stronger than they appeared. Carol's attempts to escape the syndicate had been an act of desperation, but the forces she was up against were far too powerful to overcome. The more the FBI uncovered, the clearer it became that the Johnson family had been trapped in a world of crime and deceit, a world they had never chosen to be a part of, but had been forced into because of their connection to John's involvement. The discovery of the DNA match provided a crucial piece of the puzzle, revealing that the Johnsons had been hiding from forces far beyond their control. They had never intended to disappear forever. They had been trying to escape, trying to protect themselves from the consequences of John's actions. The FBI now understood that the family's disappearance wasn't a random act, nor was it a voluntary flight. It was the result of a series of dangerous decisions that had placed the Johnson family in the crosshairs of a criminal empire that was willing to do anything to protect its interests. The investigation into the Johnson family's disappearance had uncovered layers of deceit, danger, and betrayal. It became clear that the family's story was one of survival, and that their actions, while motivated by a desire to escape, had ultimately led them down a path from which there was no return. As the FBI pieced together the full extent of the story, they came to realize that the Johnson family had been victims of a much larger criminal network, a network that had gone undetected for years, hidden in plain sight within the small town of Chesterfield. Now, with these revelations coming to light, the truth about the Johnsons' disappearance began to emerge, and with it, a chilling realization that the family had been caught in a web of organized crime they couldn't escape. After 53 long years of uncertainty and unanswered questions, the FBI's investigation into the mysterious disappearance of the Johnson family finally reached its conclusion. For decades, the small town of Chesterfield had lived with a haunting memory of the Johnsons vanishing without a trace, a mystery that had puzzled residents and law enforcement alike. As the years passed, the case seemed to fade into obscurity, relegated to the status of an unsolved cold case, with few believing that the answers would ever come to light. However, in 2022, a breakthrough occurred, one that not only solved the mystery of the Johnson family's disappearance, but also revealed a shocking and far more complex truth than anyone could have ever imagined. The investigation led by the FBI suggested that, contrary to the original assumptions that the Johnsons had simply vanished of their own accord, they had in fact been forced into hiding. The evidence pointed to the fact that the family's disappearance was directly tied to John Johnson's involvement with a local criminal syndicate. For years, the family had lived under the radar, in secrecy, using assumed identities in order to escape the dangerous criminal empire that had been slowly encroaching on their lives. They had made the painful decision to disappear and live in hiding, unable to reach out for help, because doing so would have exposed them to the very dangers they were trying to escape. The FBI's findings painted a picture of a family that had been living in fear, not out of any wrongdoing on their part, but because of their connection to John's illicit activities. John, a quiet and reserved man, had unwittingly pulled his family into the treacherous world of organized crime. His involvement with the syndicate had escalated over time, and while he had tried to shield his family from the truth, the very nature of his actions eventually led to the family being targeted. The criminal syndicate, once it realized that John might be a liability, decided to take action to ensure that he couldn't expose their operations. In the end, the Johnsons were forced to flee, leaving behind their home, their friends, and everything they had known in order to survive. The townspeople of Chesterfield, who had known the Johnson family for years, were left stunned by the revelations. The family that had once seemed like the perfect picture of suburban life had been living in secret, trying to escape the very people they had never intended to get involved with. It was a devastating truth for many in the town, as they had lived alongside the Johnsons for years, unknowingly sharing their lives with a family that had been hiding such a dark and dangerous secret. It left the residents of Chesterfield with more questions than answers. How could a family that had appeared so normal, so familiar, have been living a life so different from what anyone had imagined? The shocking nature of the investigation's findings left many of the town's residents questioning everything they thought they knew about the Johnsons. For years, the town had seen the Johnson family as an example of quiet, hard-working, and respectable people. Neighbors who were always willing to lend a hand and who had shown no signs of trouble. Their home had been one of the most trusted in the neighborhood. Carol, the mother, had been a loving and devoted figure, and John, though somewhat quiet, had been seen as dependable and loyal. To learn that they had been living under assumed names, hiding from a dangerous criminal organization, shattered the image the town had built of them. It was hard for the townspeople to reconcile the friendly family they had known with the secrets the FBI had uncovered. The town of Chesterfield, once known for its peaceful charm, was now faced with a reality that no one had ever anticipated. The Johnson family's disappearance was not the result of some tragic accident or an impulsive decision to start a new life. Instead, it was a deliberate and necessary action, taken by a family who had no other choice but to go into hiding in order to protect themselves from the criminal syndicate that had infiltrated their lives. The FBI's investigation revealed a network of deceit, fear, and danger that had been lurking beneath the surface of the seemingly idyllic town. And while the family's story had been one of survival, it was also a story of betrayal and manipulation. How one man's involvement with crime had ultimately led to the destruction of everything he held dear. In the end, the Johnson family had never intended to disappear forever. They had hoped to escape the clutches of the syndicate and build a new life, away from the dangers that had been closing in on them. But the threat of violence and retribution had made that impossible. They had been forced to live in secrecy, unable to reach out for help, all while trying to protect their children from the dangers that came with being entangled in the criminal world. The family had been living a life of constant fear, hiding from the very people who had once seemed like friends, and whose involvement in illegal activities had led to their forced disappearance. The town of Chesterfield was forever changed by the truth about the Johnson family's fate. The discovery of their long-hidden secret brought the town's dark underbelly into the light, showing just how easily things could go awry when hidden connections and dangerous individuals were involved. For the residents of Chesterfield, the answers they had been waiting for were not comforting. They were sobering, unsettling, and left a lasting impact on how they viewed the town's history. The truth about the Johnsons' disappearance had been buried for over 5 decades, but now, with the FBI's investigation shedding light on the mystery, it seemed that no one could look at the past in the same way again. The shocking discovery of the Johnson family's true fate raised important questions about trust, loyalty, and the hidden dangers that could be lurking beneath the surface of even the most seemingly ordinary lives. For the townspeople of Chesterfield, the case was no longer just about the Johnsons. It was about the fact that, in any small town, the people you think you know best may be hiding more than you could ever imagine. The mysteries that had been buried in the town's history were now brought to the forefront, forever altering the way the community viewed itself and its past. In the end, the mystery of the Johnson family's disappearance was solved, but the truth was far darker and more complex than anyone had ever imagined. The FBI had unearthed the evidence that had been hidden for over 5 decades, and the family's fate was no longer a question. However, for the townspeople of Chesterfield, the discovery of the Johnsons' secret life and the criminal forces that had driven them into hiding would forever change how they viewed their community, their history, and the hidden dangers that lurked just beneath the surface.